Good morning. Here we are for talking about Falkland Wars. Inside this book, um, Falkland Wars, the full story by Sunday Times. This was made in September 1982. So I was born in May 19 May in 1982. So I was born just the day before the British forces went inside the Falklands to the recovery for the islands. So it's part of my heritage. Not as British, I'm not Argentinian, but on the time that the events happened, I was came into the world. So I am quite concerned by the age of my life by this conflict. It's interesting remembering the beginning of the conflict in those sides, the British line and the Argentinian line of conversation. Because we know that the World Cup in Argentina in 1978 was inside a dictatorship. So the Argentinian winning, Mario Kempes and other good players like Jorge Valdano mm, were winning a cup inside a country with a dictator, and it was later known by the disappearance of people in the engineering school of the army. So it was a bad time for the people, and on that um, situation was very important. Remembering that mm, another type of situation that is the sanctions, the sanctions for the country for Argentina, um, giving the opportunity to view clearly what con- mm, the governing dictator was giving to their people. So um, the process of industrialization in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s were in composing inside the country the type of elements that were imported before. So they had the type of economy of having a lower class of products. The imported products were high level, but there was no possibility of absence of products. But the people with possibilities in wasting were interested in Western products, in Mercedes, in L'Oreal, in Moët Chandon, not in Argentinian cars and makeup made in Argentina. No. So they thought in the end of the dictatorship that in that case there was very difficult to support Galtieri and their comrades. So there was a very proud difficulty, the difficulty in getting proud in anything without the supporting of the dictatorship. Only the guns could make possible the supporting of the dictatorship. So it was a composing item about trying to give an opportunity of remaking the coalition with the Argentinian people, in the idea that with Sandwich and Falklands, the Argentinian people will reunite on the idea of supporting the government, but the government didn't know that the people were thinking more on the possibility on going on New York, on Paris, on importing products, for Western products for their living. So there was a decoupling of the society and the government, and finally the government thought a little war, can be possible of making that way. On the other side, we have Britain in 1979. The Labour Party lost the power, and Margaret Thatcher won the power for absence of Labour, because the 70s was a very bad time for politics in Britain. So that time, Conservative Party thought it was time for making conservative revolution, and Conservative Party with the panel of climate change and the idea of carbonization of the so I thought the carbon mines, were very bad for the while um, for the environment, for the wild environment. So they thought in the Thatcher cabinet, in the government, that would be a good idea in going straight against the mines, even with the concept of the trade unions. Trade unions were very important of the supporting of Labour Party. So the idea of giving out of power the trade unions was a good idea for ongoing the power of Conservative Party, with one spirit what was made in Watergate matter, because when um, the president Richard Milhouse Nixon came into power in 1979, 1969, I think before Margaret Thatcher in coming in power. So in 1969, the year of the moon, in that day, they thought there were decades of democratic power in Washington D.C. So in the chambers, in House of Commons and this House of the Lords inside the colonies, so that was called the Congress, the Senate, and the House of the Representatives. So, in that chambers, there was a very long time controlled by the Democratic Party, and the House of the White House was also controlled by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then by Harry S. Truman. So, and of course, within the um, interludium of Ike, with David Eisenhower, returning with John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. So democratic control of main politics was very huge. So the Nixon administration wanted a control of every single democratic candidate to be defeated in any way, in any condition, and that's what Carl Bernstein and Woodward investigated for the Washington Post, the Watergate affair. Not a thief in the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. No, not only that was a deeper case, given in the book All the President's Men by Bernstein and Woodward. So 10 years later of this beginning of the case, mainly the idea was similar, but Britain was very different. The idea was taking the grassroots of the Labour Party with the trade unions and the mines, and the idea of giving out power and supporting in the base for the party. But in those years, in 1981, that was the year, for example, in arts for Alan Moore of taking youth of V for Vendetta, the comic that was made in the early beginning of the 21st century, a movie by the producing of Wachowski brothers. So in those days, there was the possibility of the falling of the Thatcher administration. So in those days, they priced for one thing to reunite the country and the people because it was very poor opinion of Margaret Thatcher in their economic and social procedures. So when Galtieri and his comrades came out to invade Falklands, there was heaven open for Miss Thatcher. It was the opportunity of giving the army the Avro Vulcan, the flying sector was very important. They were gave out of production, gave out of the army, and reinvent gave a new life from Abrobuncan and for the Navy reuniting in Ascension Island in the middle of Atlantic, close of St. Helens, where Napoleon was imprisoned in the early beginning of the 19th century. So they gave a big jump in the Atlantic for giving Ascension Island and then in Falklands because Galtieri and his comrades thought, oh, there are a few people, it's an island in the south, the deep south of the Atlantic, and it's they are in crisis. British are in crisis and they will not support a war far away from the mainland. And in these years, with the decolonization in the 50s and in the 60s and the 70s, so it's clear for Argentina that they will lose, and people of the army, the navy, the air force, especially the air force with the exocets, were very important in giving a hard war for the Argentinians. But that's what the book wants to explain, because in that war, possibly the last war like that was made in the 20th century, but and here comes the year before this, 2022, in the war in Ukraine, giving back time to the trenches and another elements proper of the Western Front in World War One. So it's curious what history can teach about everything to us. So it was clearly for the beginning of the 21st century that this war was the late idea of war like in 20th century was thought, but uh, because in as we here here in the map we see the idea of the total exclusion zone made by the British. It's important because when outside the zone in May 2, Grano was sunk by the Conqueror submarine, The idea, but the Argentinians launched the idea that, oh, they are giving up the rules and they are going outside the gentleman, outside the. No, because there was not neutral rules. There were rules made by the British. So the British were the idea of being compliant or not compliant. So if the Argentinians didn't want to follow the rules imposed by the British, of course they could make this because it was not an exclusion zone by the United Nations or inside the Council of Security Council in United Nations, as I said. So it was a convention made by one part of the war, and of course there are very interesting things inside the Falklands and the capital and the armies and the battles and the people inside the Falklands living there because if the war never came into, they're possible that in a few years the decolonization, the absence of interest of Britain would become in a type of devolution for Argentina, giving Falklands for them. Yes, it's true that in the 20th century was not what in 21st century we know about the possible zones of oil, maybe gas in the surrounding area, important for the Britain. Mm, but in those times there was rocks in the deep South Atlantic, so it was mainly ships and Welsh people and some Scottish. So there was no real interest because that's not in the main traffic area for commerce. So if Altieri couldn't make that stupid movement, probably the Falklands would have passed soon or later for the hands of the Argentinians. That's what if that we will never know, but it's important for historians to learn about history and the other ways that we've never taken. So it's interesting remembering what people were about Falklands War. Um, Here, Sunday Times, very important newspaper, giving a book about the global comprehensive approaching of what Falcons War, the full story, was about for British, for Argentinians, and for the whole world. So here is an approach that I read, and thank you, and goodbye.